There are moments when a state begins to speak in a different register, not louder, not more dramatic, simply more conditional. When a president stands before parliament and frames the future of a capital city around the possibility of rain, something has already shifted. The sentence sounds technical, temporary, manageable, but the structure behind it is not. The reservoirs that feed Tehran have fallen to levels not seen in decades. 5 primary basins reduced to fractions of their intended capacity. One of the key dams hovering near empty. Numbers presented as percentages: 13%, 1%. They read like accounting entries. They are not. They are thresholds. Official meteorological agencies have begun using language that rarely appears in public briefings. Day 0. The point at which distribution systems no longer function as systems. When water is no longer delivered by infrastructure but by improvisation. Tankers, ration cards, timetables. At first, the phrasing sounds theoretical. Then the contingency plans begin circulating inside ministries. If rainfall does not return, if pressure drops further, if consumption cannot be curtailed. And this is where the main thing begins, not with protest, not with slogans, but with conditional verbs embedded in executive speech. Tehran is a city of more than 15 million people. It does not operate on hope. It operates on flow. Water to pumps, pumps to towers, towers to apartments. Interrupt that chain, and the disruption is not symbolic. It is biological. Yet the warnings came framed as weather dependence, as if the fate of a modern capital rests primarily on clouds. Beneath the public language, analysts have been tracing a longer arc. Aquifers drawn down over decades, riverbeds reduced to sediment channels, wells deepened, then deepened again. Between the early 2000s and the late 2010s, the country extracted groundwater volumes that exceed what its natural recharge cycles can restore within any meaningful human timeframe. This is not seasonal scarcity. It is structural overdraft. Some specialists have begun referring to it not as shortage, but as depletion with no recovery horizon, bankruptcy. The word appears in technical discussions, rarely in political ones. What makes this more unsettling is not only the water that is gone, but the land responding to its absence. In several provinces, subsidence rates have reached levels far beyond global norms. The ground compresses as aquifers empty. Geological layers collapse inward. In parts of the capital, measurable sinking is no longer hypothetical. Infrastructure designed for stability now rests on contracting soil. Airports, rail corridors, industrial complexes. At this point, the system usually shows its limits, not in speeches, but in hairline fractures. Ancient structures in historic cities have begun displaying visible stress. Fissures in masonry, uneven foundations. Bridges that once spanned flowing rivers now stand over dry channels, their weight pressing on hollowed earth. It seems insignificant until you connect the sequence. Water removed, cavities formed, ground compacted, surface shifts. And what appears as isolated damage becomes part of a pattern. The agricultural sector consumes the overwhelming majority of national water use. Irrigation methods remain inefficient in large swaths of the country. Loss rates through outdated systems are substantial. Urban distribution networks leak before supply reaches households. Treatment plants operate at a cost that outpaces infrastructure renewal. The arithmetic is straightforward. Extraction exceeds recharge. Losses exceed savings. Demand exceeds reform. Meanwhile, electricity shortages intersect with water delivery. Pumps require power. High-rise buildings depend on pressure systems. When planned outages extend beyond peak summer months, the consequence is not limited to darkness. Water stops climbing to upper floors. Refrigeration fails. Communications narrow. The crises converge quietly. And when systems converge, resilience diminishes. Public unrest did not begin with hydrology. It began with inflation, with currency erosion, with prices rising beyond wages. But beneath economic grievance lies physical strain. Households navigating rationed water schedules. Families adjusting daily routines to nocturnal flow windows. Farmers watching fields turn saline. These are not abstract grievances. They accumulate. Surveys conducted inside the country indicate that a significant portion of the population attributes the water crisis to domestic governance rather than external pressure. That judgment matters less for its political implication and more for what it signals about trust. When environmental decline becomes personalized, it alters the relationship between state and citizen quietly. Over the past 3 decades, hundreds of dam projects have been commissioned. Large-scale construction reshaped river systems across one of the driest regions on Earth. Proponents framed them as development. Critics questioned evaporation losses, downstream depletion, sedimentation, financing flowed. Engineering arms of powerful institutions expanded their portfolios. The projects generated revenue. They also altered hydrological balances in ways that are now difficult to reverse. But this part is rarely discussed openly within official narratives. At the same time, tens of thousands of wells, legal and otherwise, punctured aquifers that had taken centuries to accumulate. In certain periods, previously unauthorized wells were regularized rather than sealed. Each decision incremental, each authorization administrative. It seems procedural until the cumulative effect becomes visible in empty basins and sinking terrain. Environmental degradation does not remain confined to water tables. As wetlands recede and forest cover diminishes, dust intensifies. Urban air quality deteriorates. Hospitals report seasonal spikes. Schools close intermittently. Pollution becomes another layer of daily negotiation. When water, air, and electricity converge in instability, the system enters a different phase. Maps of recent demonstrations show concentration in provinces where subsidence and water rationing have been most acute. Correlation does not imply causation, but spatial overlap invites examination. Regions once sustained by rivers now depend on transfers. Transfers depend on reservoirs. Reservoirs depend on rainfall that has become increasingly erratic, and the political response remains reactive. Security measures have intensified in response to unrest. Communication networks experience interruptions during peak tension. Official apologies have been issued following episodes of force. Yet none of these address aquifer recharge rates or infrastructure leakage. The physical variables remain unchanged by rhetoric. Some external analysts have begun modeling long-term scenarios. Population displacement projections tied to water scarcity. Declines in renewable supply under climate stress. Migration from western and northern provinces if extraction continues at current rates. These are not immediate outcomes. They are trajectories. And trajectories, once established, require structural correction to alter. The most sensitive element may not be the shortage itself, but the institutional entanglement surrounding water management. Construction contracts, licensing frameworks, regulatory oversight, economic interests embedded within extraction and dam building cycles. Reform in one sector intersects with power in another. This is where the structure begins to show internal tension. When a head of state publicly contemplates rationing in the capital, the message extends beyond weather. It signals strain in the foundational promise of governance, provision of basic utilities. A state that cannot reliably deliver water to its primary urban center faces a legitimacy question that cannot be deferred indefinitely. At present, the capital's reservoirs remain at historically low levels. Ground subsidence continues in measurable increments. Agricultural consumption patterns have not fundamentally shifted. Illegal wells persist in multiple provinces. Drought classifications expand across regions. Inflation pressures compound environmental ones. Each factor manageable in isolation, together less so. And this is where the structure hesitates. The physical environment is adjusting faster than institutional adaptation. The data is available. The warnings are articulated. The thresholds are approaching. What remains uncertain is whether the system that oversaw decades of extraction can recalibrate itself before the next conditional sentence becomes declarative. The hesitation becomes measurable at the point where extraction data intersects with institutional control. The water system does not operate as a neutral utility grid. It is embedded in a network of contracts, licensing authorities, construction conglomerates, and security-linked engineering firms that expanded aggressively over 3 decades. Reservoirs were not simply built to store water. They were built to generate revenue streams, employment networks, and political leverage. Once that architecture solidified, policy flexibility narrowed. Groundwater depletion accelerated in parallel with surface dam construction. On paper, dams signaled modernization. In practice, they altered river flow timing, increased evaporation in high heat zones, and encouraged agricultural expansion in areas never hydrologically stable. The cycle reinforced itself. More irrigation demand justified more diversion. More diversion justified deeper wells. When aquifers began to collapse, the response was rarely restriction. It was legalization. Tens of thousands of previously unauthorized wells were absorbed into regulatory frameworks rather than closed. That single administrative choice locked depletion into the legal economy. Agriculture consumes close to 90% of national water use. Yet irrigation efficiency improvements lag behind global standards. Flood irrigation remains widespread. Up to 70% of agricultural withdrawals are lost before reaching root systems. Urban infrastructure compounds the problem. Leaking distribution networks for treated water account for losses exceeding 40% in some cities. In other words, scarcity is amplified not only by climate variability, but by structural inefficiency at every stage of the chain. Electricity shortages deepen the feedback loop. Water pumping stations depend on stable energy supply. Planned blackouts disable vertical distribution in high-density housing. When power cuts extend beyond seasonal peaks, apartment buildings lose pressure. Households adapt by storing water in improvised containers, increasing contamination risk. Industrial facilities face forced shutdowns to reallocate electricity toward residential demand, which reduces economic output and tax revenue that might otherwise fund infrastructure repair. The system begins consuming its own capacity. Subsidence transforms hydrological mismanagement into physical risk. When aquifers are emptied, soil compacts irreversibly. Infrastructure cannot be re-leveled without enormous cost. Airports and railways require geometric precision. Refinery pipelines tolerate limited ground movement. Once subsidence surpasses tolerances, maintenance becomes constant rather than periodic. That shifts budget priorities from expansion to stabilization. It also limits mobility options in emergency scenarios. Environmental degradation compounds political strain through air quality decline. As wetlands dry and forest cover retreats, dust frequency increases. Urban particulate concentrations rise. Hospital admissions correlate with seasonal dryness. Health expenditure rises alongside water transport expenditure. Two separate ministries begin competing for shrinking fiscal space. Public perception has adjusted accordingly. Surveys indicate a decisive majority attribute the water crisis to domestic governance rather than external sanctions or climate alone. That shift is critical. When environmental collapse is interpreted as administrative failure, the crisis moves from technical to political terrain. Protest geography reflects this transition. Demonstrations cluster in provinces with high subsidence rates and water rationing schedules. The overlap is consistent. Security responses have addressed surface instability. They have not altered extraction volumes. Communication shutdowns suppress coordination temporarily. They do not recharge aquifers. Official apologies acknowledge force. They do not repair distribution pipelines. Institutional reflex favors containment rather than recalibration. The most consequential constraint lies within the economic interests tied to water infrastructure. Engineering divisions associated with powerful security institutions maintain significant stakes in dam construction, drilling contracts, and maintenance agreements. Any pivot toward decommissioning dams, reducing irrigation allocation, or sealing wells directly affects revenue and patronage networks. Reform therefore collides with entrenched financial structures. The mechanism resists correction because correction redistributes influence. Long-term projections intensify the pressure. Renewable water supply is expected to decline further, and continued over-extraction could trigger large-scale internal migration from western and northern provinces toward already strained cities. Urban density would rise exactly as supply reliability weakens. If reservoir levels in the capital remain near critical thresholds, rationing shifts from emergency response to routine policy. Routine scarcity reshapes behavior. Private storage expands. Informal supply networks emerge. Access inequality widens. The state moves from provider to manager of shortage. And that shift affects legitimacy more deeply than any external confrontation. The contradiction is structural. A system capable of projecting military power struggles to secure municipal water stability. Deterrence does not refill aquifers. External leverage does not stabilize sinking ground. The tension accumulates quietly. Fiscal strain, elite fragmentation over resources, broad-based survival grievances, and a shared narrative linking depletion to governance now intersect. Historical patterns suggest that when these variables converge, systems enter transition phases. The timing is uncertain. The trajectory is not. The issue is no longer rainfall. It is adaptability. Can extraction-driven revenue models be dismantled? Can irrigation policy contract without destabilizing food supply? Can illegal wells be sealed despite protected interests? Each correction challenges entrenched authority. Water bankruptcy has moved from theory to terrain. Aquifers cannot be replenished within political cycles. Subsidence is effectively irreversible. Infrastructure will demand increasing maintenance at the expense of expansion. Even now, pumps operate and reservoirs hold partial capacity. Order remains visible, yet extraction still exceeds recharge. Incentives still favor depletion. Security remains oriented outward. The question is whether institutional restructuring occurs before physical instability becomes the defining feature rather than the warning sign.